as Vishankar said, I'm, well, the teaching of individuality is one that's very close to my heart. I've been trying to become an individual for about 45 years now, and it's not easy, I can tell you. It's really quite difficult at times. I'm hoping that this talk will challenge you. It should challenge you, because I'm going to talk about what an individual is, or a true individual is. And probably many of us are not quite true individuals yet. And so I hope, and I think this talk will challenge you somewhat. So the talk is called The Individual, the Group and the Spiritual Community. So let me first of all talk about the group. Actually, even before I do that, the whole idea of individuality goes back a long way, many, many years, hundreds of years, thousands of years. There was a man in a German Austrian philosopher come psychologist called Karl Jaspers, who wrote a book, and he talked about what he called the Axial Age. And between 900, 800 BC, as we used to say, before Christ, but now we say BCE, before the Common Era, between 800, 900 before Common Era to 200 before Common Era, something really big happened in many parts of the world. I've got a book here called The Great Transformation by Karen Armstrong, which is all about that, and it's subtitled The World in the Time of Buddha, Socrates, Confucius and Jeremiah. So that gives you a very strong clue as to what the Axial Age was about. In different parts of the world, India, for instance, Greece, Persia and China, things happened. People began to emerge from the societies of those times with a new way of looking at the world. And basically, they managed somehow to realize that they weren't necessarily part of the group that they belonged to, the country or the region or whatever. They managed somehow to see things outside of their group conditioning. And they were individuals: Confucius, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the Buddha, some of the great Hindu teachers, and also the Jain teachers as well, the great Mahavira from the Jain tradition. They all began to see things in their own way. So they emerged from the group, or the group from which they emerged. And so let me just say a few words about what I mean by the group, or what Sangharakshana means by the group. A group is any bonding of people brought together based on common interests, common values. And the first one you're born into is the family. That's a group. So that's tied by blood, you could say. And then the next kind of group is soil. The territory that you were born into and that you live in, that's another kind of group, the people who live in that territory. And then as times went by, you know, the country. Nowadays there's race, of course. That's a fairly new idea, actually. Race, it's only a few hundred years old, the idea of race, but you know, there's now racial groupings. And there are political groups, of course. Politics seems to be really groupish, really tribal. So, you know, you've got left wing, right wing, they're getting a bit out of date now, but you've got the identity politics people and the anti-identity politics people. And what happens with that is people become very groupish. One of the aspects of being a member of a group is that it's like, if you're a real group member, you don't really see individuals. You can't really understand the idea of someone being an individual and having their own thoughts. You only see them as being opposite to you or opposing you in some way. The group or groups tend to be power-based, so that it's quite hard for you to be an individual in a group, and other people in that group tend to try to stop you from becoming an individual. But there are different kinds of groups, of course. There are what you might call a negative group and what you might call a positive group. And a negative group really prevents you from becoming an individual. That is to say, it prevents you from having your own free thoughts about things, your own beliefs, your own values and so on. And totalitarian regimes are a very good example of that kind of group. Yesterday afternoon, I was taking part in a demonstration in centre of Manchester, Piccadilly Gardens, with the Free Hong Kong people. And at the moment, what's happening is 12 youths were trying to escape from Hong Kong because the CCP, the Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party, were after them because they demonstrated against what's happening with Hong Kong at the moment. And they were in a boat on their way to Taiwan to escape, and they were intercepted by the authorities, and now they're in prison somewhere in China, and nobody's heard anything about them. So that's the Chinese Communist Party are a very, very good example of a negative group. We live in our society, in British society, it's a positive group, because a positive group allows people to become individuals. It allows, even if it doesn't encourage them, at least it allows them to become individuals. So you're allowed to have your own thoughts about things. You're allowed to have your own beliefs. You're allowed to strike out on your own. And you're even allowed to say what you think, as long as it's not encouraging people to violence and so on. Although that particular freedom that we've got at the moment is being impinged upon. I might say a bit more about that a bit later. But basically, that's what a group is. And an individual is someone who has somehow managed to emancipate themselves from the group. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. I'm going to talk about the qualities of the true individual. Some of them, I can't talk about all of them, I haven't got time, but some of the ones that I think are key to what an individual really is. But before I start talking about the qualities, one of the things that Banti thought was important was that although you can talk about the qualities of the individual, in the end, an individual is indefinable. You could even almost say somewhat mysterious. Every individual is different from every other individual. So you can't really put them in a box by characteristics and so on. But we get some way towards understanding what this individual is by talking about some of the main characteristics that we can see in various individuals. So first of all, they're free from the group. They've emancipated themselves from the group. Well, what does that mean? It means that when you're in a group, you want to belong to that group, and you're emotionally dependent upon belonging to that group. You're emotionally dependent on the approval of the people in that group. And it's a very, very strong urge. It's a very strong need for people to feel they belong, that they're accepted, that and they're approved of. These are very, very strong urges that we have, almost instinctual, I think. There was a little while ago that I was in a panel online, and I differed from nearly everyone in that panel, and it was a really hot topic. And I knew I was going to have to say what I thought. And I was surprised at how frightened I was to say what I thought. Because it's just a bunch of order members, you know, I'm sure they love me, but it was very, very hard for me to actually say what I thought, because I knew it would be very unpopular. And afterwards I reflected on it. I thought, why was that so frightening? I think it must be instinctual. It must be that when you, in the olden days, you know, like, you know, many, many years ago, well, even now in China, for instance, or Iran, places like that, it means death. That if you go against the group and you say what you really think, it means you're going to die. So I think that's what was happening to me at the time. It was irrational, but it was to do with the age-old need for groups to cohere, and that if you get out of that, that's it for you. Of course, it's not in our order, hopefully. So freedom from the need for group approval. And this is what Vishankar was talking about earlier, the need to stand on your own 2 feet. And when you do stand alone, and when you do say what you really think, and it happens to be not what the group thinks, you can sometimes become very unpopular. I know that I'm very unpopular in certain parts of the movement and the order now for some of the things that I think. And so what that means is that you need to have courage. One of the I'll come on to that in a minute, actually, when we talk about learning to think for yourself. But freedom from the group, freedom from the need to belong to a group. And hence, that's why in our movement, in our order, solitary retreats are encouraged, that you just go away for a week, 2 weeks, a month. I did a 10-week one once when you're not in contact with any of your friends, anybody that you know, and you're completely alone. And then you realize how much you need the group and how much you need to emancipate yourself from that need. Okay, and the next one is self-aware. That's the next characteristic of the group. In a way, that comes first. It's self-awareness that allows you to realize that you're separate. I often tell the story of my first experience of self-awareness. It was on my 5th birthday, and my parents had organized a little party amongst my friends, and we were all having this great time, you know what children do at 5. Then I went to the toilet and I closed the door, and I could hear all the hullabaloo outside, all the laughter and so on. But I realized as I closed the door, I thought, oh, I'm me. It was my first dawning of self-awareness that I'm not everybody else. I'm a separate person. And it's out of that sense of self-awareness that individuality can grow. And, you know, most people have got some kind of rudimentary sense of self-awareness, but they don't usually work on that and strengthen it and so on. But it all comes out of a sense of self-awareness. The awareness, not only of things around you, but you're aware of your awareness. It's the awareness of being. And hence, that's why mindfulness is such a big deal in the Buddhist tradition, because your practice of mindfulness helps you to become more individual. It helps you to really develop your self-awareness. I should say, actually, that part of this, I should talk about I have talked about solitary retreats. Okay, so self-awareness, that's the seed. And then thinking for yourself. An individual thinks their own thoughts. Now, very often when people talk about thinking for themselves, they think of the freedom aspect, the freedom to have any thoughts that they want to have. But thinking from, most people take their thoughts from other people. So it's the quality of choosing whatever thoughts from other people you want to have. But thinking with yourself is a bit different. It's a bit harder than that. It's where you really think something through yourself. You haven't taken that thought on from anyone else. And hence the practice of reflection in Buddhism, where you really think things through. You know, there are Buddha figures all over the place now, aren't there? It's, you know, in shops and in restaurants, Buddha figures everywhere. And the Buddha always seems to be meditating. But is he meditating actually? Or is he thinking? Is he thinking something through? Because the Buddha was a great thinker, a really good thinker. So it's an individual thinks for themselves. And you can only do that, you can only really think for yourself if you're somewhat emancipated from the need for group approval, because the need for group approval prevents you from really thinking. It kind of hampers your thinking. There are certain thoughts that you daren't have, because if you had that thought, that's dangerous. So thinking for yourself takes courage. So that's another aspect of individuality, actually, one that I think Artavardin mentioned in his meditation, that you need courage to stand alone. You need courage to say what you really think, and you need courage to even have the thoughts that allow you to say what you really think. So emancipation from the group takes courage. It takes real courage to be an individual. Talking of courage, the next quality that I want to talk about is emotionally positive. The individual is emotionally positive. Sangharakshita used to talk about, you know, sort of wonder, how do people become individuals? How did those ancients, you know, Socrates, Plato, the Buddha, Confucius, and so on, how did they actually get out of the group? He says that usually it happens head first. You emerge from the group head first. That is to say, you begin to see what's wrong with the group that you're in. So you become critical. You say, well, that doesn't seem right to do that, to punish that person for doing that. That doesn't seem right. Or you begin to see the limitations of the group that you're in, that it doesn't really allow people their own real freedom. So you emerge head first, and some people stay there. Now, what that means is you can see what's wrong with the group, but you're still in it. You still need the group. So you become a critic of the group, but you still need the group to belong to. So you need to take the rest of yourself out now. You need to take your whole body out of the group. Another idea that Bans used to talk about was the idea of the image of dragon's head, snake's body. So this great big head and a tiny little body coming out of it, like a tadpole body coming out of it, meaning that you're all thoughts, it's all ideas, but you're still emotionally dependent on the group for your sense of well-being. So if you emerge from the group from head first and you begin to criticize the group, and the group does need criticizing, but it can be quite negative. It can be, it doesn't really help the group in the long run. So you begin to become contemptuous of the group that you're in, or the groups around you. And that doesn't really help them to change, because if you're contemptuous, you can't really have a good relationship with those people and encourage them to change. So hence the metta bhavana that we did earlier this morning, the development of benevolence, goodwill to all, even the people in groups that you don't agree with. You feel emotionally positive towards them. And then karuna, compassion for those people, because belonging to a group is a form of suffering, and the need to belong to a group is a form of suffering, because while you're in a group, you're not completely free. And then mudita, sympathetic joy, the joy that when people do really good things and you feel really happy for those people. There are a number of people who I feel great sympathetic joy towards within Buddhism, within our order and so on, but also without. Those people who are out there saying what they really think, criticizing society, but doing it from a very, very positive point of view. And finally, upeksha, equanimity. You really need a lot of equanimity as an individual, because you will get attacked and people will refuse to really listen to you, even refuse to really engage with you at all if you're a true individual. So you need a lot of upeksha. So hence the metta bhavana and all the other practices that we do. And then what's the next thing? In a way connected with the last one is an individual takes responsibility for themselves. Vishankar very kindly talked about the fact that I do take responsibility for myself, something that I am rather proud of. But an individual takes responsibility for themselves in that they realize that actions have consequences, and their actions have consequences, and what they say has consequences on the people they speak to, and they take responsibility for their actions, the fact that their actions do have consequences. This is, you could say in more Buddhist terms, they really understand that the law of karma is a reality out there, that what you do has an effect, and they take responsibility for what they do. And when they realize that what they've done isn't so good, it hasn't had such a good effect, they take responsibility for that too. And this is where apology comes in. And an individual will apologize when they realize they've done something wrong. This is where the practice of confession comes in, because you take responsibility for yourself. When you realize you've done something unskillful, which has had not a very good effect on the people around you, you take responsibility for that. You confess that to people and you try to make amends. An individual does not blame others. That's an interesting one. They don't blame others. You know, when something goes wrong in a situation, often people will blame other people for it, but an individual won't do that. The individual will look at the whole situation, look what everyone's done, including themselves, and they will say, well, as for me, I realized that when I said that or when I did that, it wasn't very good, and I take responsibility for that. So yes, another thing that I'll just mention here, because I'm going to move on from the individual now, but I'll just mention one other thing, which is kind of connected with that, is that an individual does not take offense. We seem to be live in a very offense-taking culture at the moment. People seem to get offended at things that you say, that other people say, or what words that they use, and so on. An individual just does not take offense. They're not touchy in that kind of way. They're strong. They realize, and there's a lovely couple of things in the Pali Canon where things happen to the Buddha. You know, the famous one where a Brahmin comes up to the Buddha and he just really insults him, a stream of offensive statements to the Buddha. And the Buddha says, you know, when someone gives you an offering of food, yeah, and you don't really want that food, you don't really need it right now, yeah. So you give it back to the person who's given you the food and you say, no, I don't really need it, thank you. Who does that food belong to? It belongs to the person who tried to give it to me. So in a similar way, you've just really insulted me and I don't really want that, thank you. So I'm going to give it back to you. That's a lovely one. There's another lovely one where, again, I think it was a Brahmin, was asking the Buddha questions and they were kind of rather unpleasant, you know, sort of confrontative questions. And at one time, this Brahmin asked the Buddha a question and the Buddha said, you asked that question quite rudely, but I'll answer you anyway. Yeah. So I love all that. It's really great. Going back to thinking for yourself, actually, I've just thought of, now that I'm talking about the Buddha, I just remembered another instance where the Buddha, someone, not a Brahmin this time, but a teacher from a different tradition, decides to take the Buddha on in debate. Poor man. And he brought all his disciples with him. So there's like hundreds of people there watching this debate. And the Buddha asks, at some point in the debate, the Buddha asks this man a question. And what do you think? And the man answers him and he says, and everyone else thinks that too. And the Buddha says, what all these other people got to do with you? Please answer for yourself. Yeah. So, you know, this man was bringing the group in, you know, we all think this, so we must be right. And, you know, one of the things that Bhante used to say, Sangharaj used to say was, rather provocatively, the group is always wrong. Yeah. So that's the individual. There are many, many more qualities of the individual that I could talk about, but I don't have time. So I'm going to talk about the near enemy. You know the idea of the near enemy of something. The near enemy of the individual, the far enemy is the group. The near enemy, or the far enemy, is a group member. The near enemy is the individualist. The individualist. Now, the individualist can look at first like an individual, but they're not. So an individualist is, there are different kinds of individualists. One kind of individualist is the strongest member of the group. They rise to the top. They've got some kind of strength or charisma or something. And so they rise to the top and they begin to lead the group. That person is an individual. They're just the strongest member of the group, or the cleverest member, you could say. Another kind of individualist is the rebel or the contrarian, the one who sees all the problems with the group and always argues against, and they get something out of that. Ultimately, they're still dependent on the group, but it's a kind of code, it's a contrary dependency. And they need the group in order to feel that they're really alive and they're, I don't know, confirmed in their identity just by being contrarian. And then there's another kind of individualist, and you get this a lot online with different kinds of people. One of the kinds of people is the very beautiful person who can speak well, or maybe they sing well or something, and they become an influencer on YouTube. And, you know, they got thousands, maybe millions of followers. They're not an individual. They just really need those followers. They need to be seen and they need to be admired. That's another kind of individualist. Okay, that's the individual, that's the group. That's the individual, that's the individualist. I'm going to talk a little bit about the spiritual community. First thing to say about the spiritual community, a true spiritual community, is it is not a group. Yeah, there are religious groups, of course, but religious groups are not spiritual communities. What is a spiritual community? Bhante once defined a spiritual community as a free association of individuals, not a free association of individualists, a free association of individuals. That is, people who can stand on their own 2 feet or want to try to learn how to stand on their own feet, take responsibility for themselves, who are trying to develop positive emotions, are learning to think for themselves. That's what study groups are all about, really, or it's part of what study groups are all about, and so on and so on. That's what essentially a spiritual community is. Is our movement, Triratna, a spiritual community? Yes and no. We're trying to become a spiritual community, but it's a very, very high ideal. For the most part, I would say the Triratna Buddhist community is a positive group, in that the people in that group, by and large, are not true individuals as yet, but they think individuality is a really good thing. They think freedom is a really good thing. And Bhante once said that the real freedom is the freedom to grow. And so we, in our movement, we encourage people to become individuals and to grow, but not by any means is everyone in our movement an individual. So we can't be called a spiritual community. But the Triratna Buddhist order should be, or is, when you become an order member, you're always aspiring to become an individual, often failing, of course. But that's basically what it means to become an order member. It means that you're really trying to be an individual and encouraging other order members to be individual, and pointing out when people aren't being individuals, and confessing to each other when you're not, when you haven't acted as an individual. So this is basically what we're trying to do. This is what it means to become an order member. And this is why sometimes someone will get inspired and they'll ask for ordination. They haven't quite understood what it means to become an order member. They see it as another part of a group, another group that they're trying to belong to. And this is why it sometimes takes a long time for someone to enter the order, because they're really good, they're really practicing and so on, they're really sincere, but they haven't quite understood yet what it means to become an individual, and therefore what the order is. And this is why at ordination, you have 2 ordinations. You have the private ordination, which is just you and your preceptor alone, and they ordain you there. That's your private ordination. You haven't yet joined the order. What that means is that you will now practice the Buddhist path as best you can, even if it meant doing it all on your own. That's what the private ordination means. You are putting your flag down as an individual and saying, this is me, this is what I want to do with my life. Then sometime later, it could be the next day, it could be a few weeks later, you have your public ordination, and that is the ordination of welcoming you into the order, which is a free association of individuals, or is aspiring to be a free association of individuals. So that's nearly the end of my talk, but I just want to finish by talking about a few words about a lecture that Sangharakshita gave in 1978 to the order, on an order convention. It was called A Vision of History. And in that lecture, he said that there are all different ways of understanding or interpreting history, but he was going to bring a way of interpreting history for our own benefit, which was, from the Axial Age onwards, you could see history as being a conflict between spiritual communities and groups, or the spiritual community and the group. They're always in conflict. Even positive groups, there's a little bit of conflict with the spiritual community. Groups are based on power. The spiritual community is based on love or metta. Groups tend to grow and they can become very, very big. Look at the Chinese Communist Party, look at China, how massive that is. And they're always trying to gobble up spiritual communities within them. The spiritual community is always at threat from the group. Yeah. So There's always this conflict, and spiritual community is a free association of individuals. The world, more than anything else, needs individuals. People who are ethical, take responsibility for themselves, are emotionally positive, and have learned to think for themselves and have the courage to say what they think to others. The world really, really needs that. So I think we could see our order as a big part of that. So there are many, many spiritual communities in the world at the moment. Ours isn't the only one. There are other Buddhist movements, of course, and so on. And I would guess that not all of them are true spiritual communities, but I expect some of them really are. But there isn't just Buddhism. There's Islam, there's Christianity, there's Judaism, and so on. Not all of them are spiritual communities, but within those communities, there can be spiritual communities. So we're not alone in doing this. And I think this is really, really important. I've been very, very inspired by the lecture all my life since. And I think this is what we're really trying to do. We're not trying to just become individuals for our own benefit. We're trying to become individuals because the world really needs individuals. And earlier I said that our society, British society, is a positive group that values freedom, freedom of belief, freedom of thought, but freedom of speech at the moment is becoming curtailed, as you probably know, with cancel culture and so on. Some people are being cancelled for saying what that means is they're being silenced for saying what they really think. And some authors, publishers are being pressured by the outside world to not publish certain books by certain thinkers. So we really need to push back against that, because once you've lost freedom of speech, then you lose democracy, you lose freedom of everything. So I'm going to end there.